And I'm Jeannie Ewing, and I have Kendall Lamb here with me today, and we're going to be talking about our complicated relationships with religion. So I just wanted to begin with just a brief disclaimer to say that Kendall and I are just sharing our lived experience, and we really just want to kind of open the conversation and demonstrate what a dialogue might be like about sharing our feelings, our thoughts, the way that our relationship with religion has changed over time. So that's really the goal here. And we've noticed, both of us, as we were talking before we went live, that in other spaces, there are these kinds of conversations opening up. So people seem to really want to talk about their brushes against religion, religious ideology, religious programming. And so we want to be really sensitive to everyone's different unique lived experiences and just simply share our own. So Kendall, do
Yep.
you want to start with your background and why you're drawn to this topic?
Yes. Yeah. Hi, everyone. It's so exciting to do a live. I haven't done one of these before. So thank you, Jeannie, for inviting me. Yes. So I was raised in the evangelical church. We would have called ourselves non-denominational, like Bible believing Christians. I was definitely in a stream of Christianity that believed that every other form of Christianity was sort of missing the mark, and we had gotten everything completely correct. And so even Catholicism and various Lutheran churches and things that we considered to be quite dogmatic and out there, we would have thought, oh, these people have missed it. They're other heathen, almost heretical, which is fascinating because there's about 40,000 different uh, types of Christianity in the world. But anyway, so I was raised in that church. I come from a long line of missionaries in my family. There was not an option to explore religions. I was often told that you really should, question everything and read everything with a discerning spirit and ask, make sure that you're really digging in and discovering. But I discovered in hindsight that that was quite um, boundaried. The amount of questions that you were really allowed to ask and exploring you were allowed to do was bound by who you got to ask those questions to. So there was always some authoritarian leader in the church and it was always a man who was the one who could give you sort of the right interpretation of whatever the biblical literature was. So we weren't literalist. I know there are a lot of evangelical streams that really believe like in a 6-day creation and everything actually happened, that Noah was really in the belly of a whale. We had a little wiggle room with that, but quite a lot of doctrine and dogma around salvation and um, who's in and who's out, and a lot of talk around, grace and things that again, came with a lot of caveats, a lot of asterisks that I had to unpack later on. So I am no longer in that stream. I don't consider myself a religious person at all anymore. Um, but I am a deeply spiritual person who looks for wonder and dare I say magic in the world. My view has opened up considerably. Um, and I feel like I've come out the other side, that I've come through something and I've arrived in a really beautiful, peaceful place on the other side, which we can get into more. But that's sort of where I
Yeah,
came up.
I want to hear more about that because
Yeah.
it's interesting to me to hear about the foundations that you had in your formative years and then where you are now. And I would love to hear more about how you got to the point where you are now and what started to maybe crumble in your worldview.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, one thing that I think is really very important for this conversation is that a lot of people who are raised in really strict religious in groups have to believe in an out group that has lost their ever loving mind. And so you are trained to see the world with a bias of us versus them. We see that right now more than ever, whether we're talking about politics or culture or whatnot. It only works if some people are holy and saved and believing things correctly and seeing things clearly. And the other group is jaded and disillusioned and lost. And so the only people in my childhood that I met really from outside of my in group were people in at school, because I went to a public school, which was actually a great thing for me in the end. And people who would come to our church and give what's called their testimony. So you have people come up, a lot of people in churches are familiar with this, who really just denounce their old way of living. And they talk about how, by the grace of being saved, they are now in this place where they have peace and happiness and meaning. And so, a lot of, like, even as a kid, I believed that all adults who were outside the church were like doing coke and orgies on the street. And they were miserably unhappy, and had porn addiction, and they had all these things that were like so bad. And then they had a come to Jesus moment and were saved. And listen, I don't mean to disparage the fact that I think a lot of people do have really incredible mystical encounters with God, whether it's in a church or outside of a church, that really help them see their life in a much more clear way, and they come more into alignment. So I honor that, and I'm not saying that people who came in were spouting lies. I think they were genuine and sincere. But I do think that what's dangerous is that when you're young and you're raised in that environment, you really do start to see the world pretty bleakly. And um, as a very observant, porous person, I'm a very empathetic, observant, porous person. I found that the more and more I spent time in the world, as they would have called it, outside of the church, the more those things started to crumble for me, because I kept falling in love with everything, with people and places and experiences. Um, it's one thing to get a lot of chatter about how the LGBTQIA community is lost and other, and whatever other rhetoric is being used, the whole like love the sinner, hate the sin nonsense. It's quite another thing to then make friends in the queer community and realize that they are just exactly like you, and deserve love as much as you do. That wasn't a hard leap for me as an empathetic person. I remember the first gay man I ever met was a painter that we had at my house named David. He would come and paint our walls. My mom went through this phase where she couldn't decide what color she wanted the house. And so David was there like every week painting a wall. It was hilarious. And he was like in theater, and he was out there, and he was wonderful. And I would come home from school and I would talk to David like every day. And he was my buddy for I don't know how long. David was out and gay, and the first person that I think I had formed like a real relationship with in that community. And it was like a hot second for me to be like, this doesn't line up. I'm having my first like real cognitive dissonance with this group is broken and lost and needs saving, versus this person is thriving as much or as little as any of the rest of us, if that makes sense. And that kept happening over and over again. So that was like in my teens. I'm 44 now. So it's been 20 years of me traveling and living in remote communities. I mean, for those that don't know me, I got a degree in evolutionary biology, which was a real stretch as an evangelical. I took jobs in marine biology all over the country. I was working and living in remote communities in Catalina Island and San Juan Island. And later, my husband and I sold our house and everything we owned, and we traveled the world for 10 years almost, give or take. And our home base was a community in Alaska off the grid that was really incredible. And all of these things shaped my falling in love with the world and people outside of my perspective. So, yeah,
That's
that's
awesome. That's beautiful. There's
yeah.
so much to say to what you're talking about, Kendall. And I'm thinking of all these things, like there's so many directions we could go with this. I'll go back to my story, and then if there's something that kind of nudges you from there, we can go from there. But so I was born and raised in a really devout Catholic home, very conservative Catholic home. It was my mom, my dad, and my younger brother and me. And everything revolved around our Catholic identity. So very much like what you were talking about, Kendall, there was this othering going on. And so the the parenting my mother primarily imparted on my brother and me had to do with this narrative that Catholics are the perfection or epitome or pinnacle of religious belief within Christianity, and that Christianity was the right way, the only way.
Yeah.
And I believed that. I really did. I sincerely felt like it was true that we were on this crusade. I studied religious history and history of Christianity, and we could trace all the way back to Peter, and it's Saint Peter we call him, and he was the first pope, and the lineage has never been broken. It was never really a conversation about the humanity of the clergy. It was always like they were on this pedestal, and we could never really question their authority, that there was this sort of orb of holiness that encircled them. And it was almost like they were untouchable in a way. So never really questioned what a priest said from the pulpit or otherwise. And yet, as a devout Catholic, growing up in a Catholic school, going to mass, learning the rosary, apologetics was huge for my family because my mother told me she had encountered growing up a lot of people who said that Catholics were the whore of Babylon, or that our priests had horns like the devil, like they were
Yeah.
part of his minions or something. So she's like, we really need to learn how to defend our faith. It's really important. So I did learn, but not until I went to public school, like what you were saying, about what are some of the beliefs and perceptions about Catholics and Catholicism in general. And I remember that in high school, probably my freshman or sophomore year, right away I met people, many people, who independently told me, I've never met a Catholic like you. And I
Mm.
was, what does that mean? And they were like, well, most Catholics we know just they go and they party and they get drunk and then they just say, "Oh, I'll go to confession on Saturday and everything will be great. I'll be saved, I'll be cleaned, cleansed."
Yeah, yeah.
And but you're not like that. Like you're really trying to be a person of integrity, try to listen to other people's perspectives. You seem like you're really open-minded. And that was when I kind of learned through that reflection and that mirroring of other people back to me that I
Mhm.
was a person of empathy too. And I also understood there's this whole world outside of the way that I was raised in my neighborhood and my predominantly white Catholic community.
Yeah.
And so going to public school was a huge, huge gift. I was exposed to other culture, other religions. I had conversations with people who were atheists or agnostic, some, who were Hindu, like, not even Christians, right? And
Right.
and I didn't travel worldwide at that point, and certainly not as widely as you have, Kendall. And at the same time, I felt like, they were bringing all of their cultures and their worlds and their languages and their universes to me. And I really wanted to honor those things, and I wanted to acknowledge the truth of their lived experiences, to recognize the sacred practices that they had in their homes and their cultural identities. And so it was the dissonance for me was that the worldview of my mother has never changed. And
Mm.
so when I lived at home, which was all the way through grad school for me, I had to live under this umbrella of the doctrinal beliefs that she held and that she very convincingly relayed to me as absolute truth. Everything was very binary growing up. I also have come to understand, and this is kind of a digression, so I won't get into it really deeply,
Okay.
that my mother's pathology of OCD really influenced this kind of rigid, dogmatic, dualistic mindset about everything. And
Mhm.
fear and shame were huge underpinnings that I carried with me all the time. And I
Mhm.
didn't notice until about 5 years ago that a lot of that was directly related to the religious programming of my youth. One of the things that so I am still Catholic. I still do believe in a personal God. I have always been very spiritual though too. And I love nature and I love the way that nature speaks to me in a spiritual sense. I also believe people when they tell me they have visions or mystical experiences and they're not part of my religious tradition. I believe that. And I've experienced things like that too. So to me, like the evolution of faith specifically has been how do I how do I contain my Catholic identity, which is a huge part of who I am, without it containing me? Like, how do I live as a Catholic in a way that is expansive, that is inclusive and welcoming, and that also acknowledges and respects and reveres other traditions and other worldviews without forcing myself to be inside of these boxes and these containers that were basically created for me and I was told I had to fit into? So that's been a really hard process for me because a lot of the narratives I started reading about Kendall, especially when I was really interested in, wait a minute, maybe this like dogmatic worldview is not really healthy. Everything I read was about deconstruction and it didn't really 100% fit for me because I really have experienced people having healthy religious communities. I have a very good friend who's Jewish and we talk about religion a lot. I've known her for 10 years. I befriended another woman who's Muslim. Same thing. It's like hearing their experiences about how religion has shaped them in a healthy way and how their communities have really rallied with them and helped form who they are in a sense. I don't believe in the total rejection of religion. I think that it's interpretation, and I think that the way that it's practiced by a lot of the leadership is where the problems lie. That's the huge problematic portion of it. That there's so much politics in the hierarchical structure of different forms of religion that the very fundamentalist practices become terrifying and dangerous. And I think that, at least for me, reading Dr. Laura Anderson's book on religious trauma very much clarified for me that fundamentalism can exist in any ideology. It's not in what we traditionally hear about in the United States from the evangelical Christian form, but it can be in any religion. It can be a no religion. That it fundamentalism really as an ideology has to do with more about adhering to these binaries and the rigidity instead of the fluidity of our thinking and the openness, the open mindset, or allowing ourselves to expand our worldviews. So that's my kind of foundations or my summary of where I began and where I am.
I love that, Jeannie. And I also, forgive me for my very jealous cat here. She, every time I talk on the phone or watch something, she's like, "Excuse me, very much." So I might put her out in a minute, but that's okay. I was talking to this wonderful man named David Hayward, who some people know as the Naked Pastor, which is an interesting moniker. He does all of these comic kind of strips and stuff like that. He used to be an ordained pastor, and now he writes a lot of books around deconstruction and the deconstruction movement. Um, but one thing that I love that he said when I was chatting with him at one point was that if you can look at world religions like the spokes around a wooden wheel, um, the core of that wheel, the round center, the solid center, at the core where all those spokes meet, you often find a lot of similarities, especially here. I'm going to put her out just a second. Okay. Sorry about that. At the core, you have a lot of similarities. So if you look at Sufism in the Muslim faith, if you look at a lot of Buddhist practices that are about beginner's mind, if you look about um, mystical Christianity, which exists and has existed for a very long time, you get a lot of the same messaging. If you follow those spokes out to the end of the wheel where you have fundamentalism at the end of all those spokes, they're all very far away from one another. And you start getting a lot of they're similar in the sense that you start getting a lot of more language about us versus them and in versus out, and it's a lot more fear-based. And I love this image because it doesn't reduce all religions to being the same. I think sometimes we hear that like, oh, they're all the same. And it's like, at their core, at their heart, I really do believe that there is a very similar stream of wisdom and knowledge. Um, but they're all also really fascinating differences. And I think if you can look at that without the lens of fear, and if you can look at that with a lot of curiosity, like you're doing, that can open up so much conversation with people. It can open up so much conversation internally with yourself about what it means that we're all asking similar questions from different angles. I mean, the prompting for my Substack name, Touching the Elephant, which I picked a long, long time ago, and now people might be like, what is that? There's an old parable about a bunch of blind men that come upon an elephant. And none of them has ever seen, heard of, or touched an elephant before. Just imagine this is a completely foreign thing. And each person represents one of the major world religions. And they all are instructed to touch this item. And they start touching it. And one person's got the tail and he's like, this is a rope. And the other one's got the trunk and it's like, no, 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 this is, you know, whatever, like a tree trunk. And one's touching the body and is like, no, this is a stone wall. And one has the ear and is like, what are you guys talking about? That's not at all what this item is. And they're just arguing about what they're touching. And of course, they're all touching the same thing from different perspectives and different angles. And when I started my Substack, it was with this real effort to like, can we not argue about what we're touching blindly? And instead, can we listen really deeply to one another so that we might learn what it is that we're touching as a collective, as a group, cooperatively instead of competitively? Can we press our ears to the body of that beast and listen to the heartbeat and say, just stop talking for a second and listen to the life in this? And I think those conversations are so life-giving and generative. And the thing that often stops us, and you mentioned this in your own story about growing up in Catholicism, is when your messaging is deeply steeped in fear and threat of eternal punishment. The stakes are too high for a lot of people to be able to deeply listen with curiosity, because we can't be in curiosity and in fear at the same time. It's impossible. So one thing I hear Liz Gilbert say, who I love, Elizabeth Gilbert, is that like if you're really in your fear brain and you start stepping into a creative practice like art, like writing, obviously, sitting to write a poem, you can't be in your fear brain at the same time. It virtually just eliminates one another. But religion often doesn't encourage curiosity and creativity. It encourages conformity, and it encourages staying in line, because the or else is this terrifying other reality. And so for a lot of people who I think just deconstruct their religion, the first major thing to go is when you stop believing in hell as eternal punishment. And people arrive at that any number of ways, either because cognitively it doesn't make sense to claim to believe in a God of love, and then also one who's going to like dump you in a pit of fire. I think pretty early people are like, that doesn't make any sense. And then people who do really study their Bibles or their scriptures, and that's very important to them. It's actually not very hard to even untangle that from the scripture. But either way, if you can get rid of that big fear pot,
Mm.
the relief that comes in, that being like, oh, I'm not going to be damned to hell for all eternity. Maybe I can sit and listen to other people's experiences and not be terrified of that. The fact that I might change my mind. That's a good thing, right? So,
Oh my gosh, so much. So I've never heard of the wagon wheel with the spokes in the center. I really want to look into that and think about that more, because that is a beautiful metaphor. And the touching the elephant story, Kendall. Wow. Have you written about that? Does that go all the way back to like your about page or?
yeah, it's a little on my about page and it's in some early posts. I probably would do well to repost some things from the beginning, because I've taken such a different direction, as we do on Substack. And now I'm primarily doing nature writing, and um, but always I'm touching the mystical in it. And I think readers know that. There's always this sense of serendipity and meaning making that happen, because that's just who I am. And I think as
Drew me.
writers, we have to do that.
That's what drew me to your writing.
Yeah.
There was that resonance with the way that I see the world and experience it too, in a very spiritual sense. But as you were talking about those two pieces, especially, I was remembering how I would say that if there maybe there is some sort of dismantling that still happens even if a person stays within a particular denomination or religious tenet. When my daughter Sarah was born almost 13 years ago was kind of this big reckoning for me where I had to consider that the containers and the labels assigned to me, they just didn't fit for my family. They did not fit for my daughter. And if I was going to be the kind of mom I really wanted to be and the kind of human I wanted to be, I was going to have to find a way to walk away from that, to step outside of it, to be able to look at a wider or a broader angle, to understand what is it like to be a person who feels marginalized? And how can I step into I'm a trained advocate because I used to be a school counselor. How can I step into this advocacy skill that I have and be able to advocate for my daughter who doesn't have a voice, at least at that point she didn't, right, as a baby, and therefore maybe somehow branch out to help other families in a similar situation to find their voices too and to realize they're not alone. And this is all connected for me, it's connected to religion because it was very fear based. And my mother often would present to me whenever I had these sparks of wonder and awe in my childhood, she would present to me, "What if this happens? I don't want you to get hurt." Or there might be if you climb a tree, you might fall. Things like that. And so I never learned what healthy risk taking looked like ever. And yet, when Sarah was born, I had to confront those fears, or I chose to. And I also chose to say, okay, what does it look like to be brave? Like, how can I still feel scared because this is foreign, it's unfamiliar, it's uncomfortable? And I also was battling with some undercurrents of shame. What if this is evil? What if this is sinful? These are, words that were stuck to me like glue at the core, that maybe it wasn't okay for me to branch outside of Catholicism to look into help for Sarah. And obviously 13 years later, I realized that it's actually very healthy to do that and it's a good idea.
Yeah.
But one of the things that just kept making me feel like our family was being pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed away to the sidelines of our faith were just the stale kind of homilies, or what Protestants might call a sermon, that I would hear every week after week, that would go back to the same Bible stories or parables or Old Testament readings and just basically regurgitate or recycle them. There was really nothing that spoke to the people or really the Jesus that I was coming to know, the Jesus who actually sought out the leper and the prostitute and the tax collector, the people that nobody really wanted, those outliers and outcasts of society. I was feeling a heart that was drawn to those people because I saw myself in them. I did not want to any longer feel like there is a level or a category of superior and inferior. And I'm just so fortunate to be part of this elite category or group. It was more like, wait a minute, I'm seeing myself more honestly. I'm noticing my own prejudices, my own biases. Raising a daughter with a craniofacial condition, I'm realizing that I'm not really the person I thought I was. And that's kind of icky and ugly feeling. But if I'm honest with myself and I allow myself to explore that, I'm also recognizing that I'm really not that different than the addicted or the homeless or the disabled, or you know what I'm saying? And this is what really long for, just hunger to hear a message from my own faith tradition that would speak into that. And there never was until I have to say about a month ago, and our family was at church on Sunday. Sometimes I'll admit I feel like I'm going through the motions. And this particular Sunday, really, I was grateful to be there because our pastor was talking in his homily about why diversity is so important. I was shocked.
Which
Totally.
shouldn't be radical, by the way. Hearing a pastor talk about that should not be radical, and yet here we are.
Oh, exactly, exactly. And it was one of those homilies that it just woke me up because I was longing for this for so many years, and here it was, this message that so I had come to the conclusion on my own long time ago. And here I was able to hear this from a leader who was well respected and renowned in our church, that everybody in our church knew. And he was saying, we need to stop arguing about whether we should have Gregorian chant or praise and worship music. We need to stop arguing about whether someone should be kneeling or whether they should be standing. Like he was saying this, he was calling it out. And he was basically pointing to the pettiness that tends to happen in religious communities or places of worship. And he was saying what matters is that we listen to, if I'm in the Gregorian chant camp, I'm going to listen with an open heart to the person who loves the guitar or praise and worship music. And I'm going to value and recognize that their perspective is equally valid to mine. It's not worse, it's not better. They exist on the same plane. And this is the message he was saying. And I was like, yes, yes. I just felt so validated because I want that to be where these kinds of conversations evolve. I want these conversations to be able to spread into our places of worship. I feel a sense of grief for Christianity as a whole, because as a Christian myself, who often is embarrassed to admit it, based on some of the things, many of the things we see happening, and many of the ways that Christianity is weaponized and is used for control. I don't want to be affiliated with that.
Yeah.
At the same time, I love the God that I've come to know, even though the God that I've come to know has become more mysterious and nebulous to me and not as much of this image of a white bearded man on a throne, but more like, how does God exist outside of what I can understand? I still feel this sense of tragedy for Christianity as a whole because we are not recognizing the dangerous and harmful and traumatic things that are going on that we're perpetuating. And nobody's really standing up, as I see it, by and large, to try to change that trajectory.
It's interesting because I so I have this fascinating double background in apologetics and evangelicism and Christian history and science and evolution and biology. So I always look at these metaphors in a different way, but things that are dying often die very loudly. Whether we're talking about an individual animal or a species. And it might be a reach to say this, but I think when we look at Christian nationalism and what's happening on the theater, the stage, there's a lot of loud dying happening right now. There is an undercurrent that I see of people in faith communities that are saying, not us. We're not doing this, that are calling it out. It's just not as loud. And I'm ever a hopeful person. I think it's great to have conversations like this. I love it because I think it's important to say, like you are, like there are a lot of Christians out there who are not standing for this and who are really appalled by it. Um, I think people who really truly love and listen to Jesus just can't help but see the incredible hypocrisy of what's going on. And I think that's been happening since the beginning of Christianity. I mean, this movement started from following a poor, vagabond Jewish rabbi who was really standing up against the establishment and saying, all these purity laws, all of this in versus out has got to stop. The kingdom is within you, which is another way of saying that your birthright is worthiness and goodness. And that was such a radical message. And so against the dominant Roman and Jewish rule that was happening at the time and in the larger community that he was in, that he was killed for it, right? And I think people's desire to sort of spread that message of love and inclusion and a radical rewiring of what they had been raised with and their very puritanical Jewish beliefs was the natural birth of that. Now, if you look through Christian history, the turning point at which that really got completely messed up was around the year 300 when Christianity got in bed with empire, when
Mm,
Constantine adopted Christianity as the major religion of Rome. And then Christianity had to align itself with a deep power structure. And the only way to keep people coming to that trough is to convince them that if they're not in that stream, they're in danger. And it
Mhm.
also aligned itself with violence and conquer, right? So the whole message got hijacked by this desire then to propel it forward and grow it into this vast religion. And so, obviously, looking back in history, we can see how that played out over and over again in really awful and grotesque ways when people are now wielding a sword alongside a cross, which is what we have now, right? Which again doesn't make sense at all. Just cognitively, holding a sword and a cross at the same time when you're worshiping or following or the disciple of a man who was killed violently at the hands of an empire while holding a sword for empire, something has gone horribly wrong, right? And that's what we see playing out on the American stage right now, without getting too like didactic about it. Just a quick history lesson, right? But in and amidst that, there have always been the people outside of that mainstream who have said, wait a minute, there's something deeply wrong with what's happening right now. And that brings me hope for, I think, where Christianity is going, um, potentially, right? Where we might see this empire, sword, Christian nationalism beast be put to rest and hopefully have something much more beautiful come out of it. But again, there's so much untangling needed there. And I think one of the things that's really important to note too with people deconstructing their faith, some people start tearing. Imagine like your faith is like a house and you're like, there is rot in this house, right? I think there is mold in the walls. I'm not sure what's going on. I'm going to take down this part because this is really bad and this part's really bad. And maybe you take that house down to the studs and you've got a pretty good frame still. And you're like, I think I'm going to rebuild this thing, right? Into something more beautiful. Some people take it down to the studs and it's rotten to the core. And they're like, I need to walk away from this house altogether and build something somewhere else. And both of those things are okay. There isn't a right or wrong way to do that. If you want to rebuild that house on the same foundation, beautiful. If that works for you and that helps you make a more loving, whole, inclusive world for you and your friends and your family, get your hammer and go do that. But if you get to the point where you're like, I just need to walk away, like it's been so bad.
Yeah.
And the trauma and all of the horrors that have happened in this house are so bad that I need to just move state, whatever that looks like, do that. I think there can be a lot of gatekeeping around deconstructing faith where it's like, well, you can deconstruct as long as you reconstruct that thing back up again. And
Mhm.
it's like, we don't get to police that. That's an intensely personal decision. And some people need to put it down for a while, and if not forever. And that's okay. That doesn't mean that they're lost. It means that they're using their curiosity and their hearts and their eyes to try and find something better. And isn't that what we're all just trying to do here is, as they say, like just walk each other home, so to speak? I mean, that looks so different for everybody. So I love that you want to stay in Catholicism and that you are so earnest and eager to hear messages that resonate with what you and your family are going through. That's beautiful. Stay there, rebuild that house into something beautiful so other people who want that too have this incredible person who feels safe and genuine and authentic to sit at their feet, you know? That's great. I
Thanks,
love
Kendall. Um, and I absolutely have had deep relationships and conversations with people where I completely understand why they have to go build a house somewhere else.
yeah.
I understand. Some trauma is just so deep that there's just no possible way that someone would want to. And I also just a huge respect for everyone's agency. Everyone has the right to decide their own boundaries, the right to decide what feels safe to them. And I've never questioned that with other people because I know what it's been like for me to be on that receiving end where the condemnation and the constant pelting of criticism and judgment is actually far more damaging and pushes me further away. And that's absolutely not what I want to do. But I have to say it's very hard to stay inside of a specific religious denomination while also trying to figure out what it looks like to reform it, especially when you're one person and you don't really have a lot of power. As a lay woman, I have really no power, except I do as a writer, and I do through using the voice that I have. And I know there's power in community. But I want to go back to what you said in the beginning of this segment that you just finished, because I just felt like this light bulb moment when you were mentioning about this unique experience and perspective that you have, particularly as from like this evolutionary biological perspective and how things die off. Because I've kind of pondered that myself, and I can see the necessity of that when it comes to religion in general, and maybe specifically for Christianity, as you mentioned as it's manifesting and playing out in the United States. One of the things that it reminded me of what you were saying, Kendall, is about 5 years ago. So it was during COVID. I had my fifth baby. I did not want to have any more children. I was passively suicidal and hated myself because as a Catholic, I had learned and I had accepted never to use any form of contraception. And so my husband and I, we agreed on that. And getting pregnant for the fifth time with very little, if any, support, I was enraged. I felt helpless and hopeless. And I also felt betrayed by the religion that told me that this was the best way to go, that embracing my fertility and never questioning it. But in fact, if I had ever chosen something else, contraception, sterilization, any kind of barrier method, then it would have been a mortal sin. It would have killed my soul. And I was terrified of that. So there was this crumbling happening to me about 5 years ago. And I remember sobbing my spiritual director. And she said to me, and I told her, why do I feel like the church I love doesn't love me? I feel like I'm losing my faith. I hate God. And she said, good. Hmm. No one said this to me before. Everybody else that I went to and was like, oh, you just need to pray more, or you need to repent, or these might be things you've heard or I've seen happen too in evangelical circles, Kendall. And it was just damaging my spirit. It was eroding my sense of self and my sense of agency. And when she said, good, you're losing your faith, good. She said, you're outgrowing it. You're shedding your skin like a snake sheds its skin. So I wanted to bring that up because of this metaphor in nature that I think is very powerful when we're talking about deconstruction, reconstruction, whatever that looks like for each person. Because you're right. Sometimes the best thing can be that dying off, that sloughing off, whether it's complete and total inoculation, and then figuring out a better way or a different way to be and to live and exist in harmony, or whether it means shedding something old and continuing to grow and expand. So I just wanted to offer that because that just struck me when you were talking about that, and that was so beautiful.
I think that's amazing. And I love that she was like, good, like things need to die. I think one of the things that I've sort of embraced, or maybe one of the things I've fallen in love with most as an evolutionary biologist, is that it makes so much sense to me that the natural order of things is life, death, rebirth, life, death, rebirth. We see this in spiritual traditions, right? Everything is constantly death and resurrection, all around us. Incarnation, death, resurrection. I see this cycle happening all the time. And yet we're given a vision of a God who's like a supernatural other being among other beings, right? Um, that is in constant stasis. This God is unchanging and will never change and is just there. And I will say, from a scientific perspective, things that are in stasis, first of all, things are never in stasis. Things never stay the same. But if they do stay same for long enough, they actually start falling apart. You think about a muscle that is atrophying if it's not in use. You think about even rocks, which seem so solid, which are crumbling and heading back out, right? Anything that is the same and in a state of of not growing and evolving is devolving. That's just sort of part of the nature of this beautiful world that we live in. And I think as humans, we're so resistant to change. It's just a very human characteristic that we want to like be somewhere and find our stability and find our people and then just stay there, right? And we know as humans that that's usually when we're in the most danger, when we're like gripping something really, really tightly and we're refusing to go along with this incredible life birth, like the birth, death, resurrection cycle. Um, but the more that you do it as a person, the more that you shed that skin and you come out and you're like, oh, I feel so much better having just gotten rid of the thing that was binding me up. I think the more that you begin to trust that process and pay attention to the fact that like all deaths should be a welcome thing. It isn't a lack of faith. Doubt is not a lack of faith. Certainty is a lack of faith. And we're sold certainty with big bows on top. You need to have all the answers and you need to check all the boxes. Well, that's a really great way to never have to change, is if you believe that you have gotten it down pat and you have figured it out. Okay, cool. And then you see people who are deeply unhappy and they're holding their megaphones on the side of the road and trying to make everybody else unhappy, right? Or just on a smaller base, it's the conversations around the dinner tables with family members who have a deep resistance to any kind of deep listening or curiosity or conversation because they've got it all figured out. And those are not fun people to spend any amount of time with. I love spending time with people who are dedicated to changing their mind on a regular basis. I love it because you meet people who are like, tell me more about that. Tell me more about where you're coming from. What is that like? I think it's interesting. There's a guy here in my town who used to be a pastor who I met with last night, and we did like a spoken word thing at a art gallery. I like stood up behind a microphone and we did this like back and forth. It was fascinating. Anyway, he he did hospice care for his dying wife for 13 years. And he said in that 13 years, he learned what it actually meant to be a pastor. He said before he went into that, he believed that it was listening to people and giving answers
Mm.
and having insight and wisdom. And by the end of that 13 years, he realized that the entire point was just bearing witness to people without any agenda whatsoever. And having attention in a conversation instead of an intention, right? Um, when you can really lean in and listen, and that's it. That's the whole game. The whole game is just noticing. And I think the more I live this life, the more that I realize that people who are dead set on observing and noticing and letting everything wash over them and change them are the most loving people in the room.
Mm.
That love actually looks a lot like paying attention without an agenda. And I think there are a lot of religions that would do really well to listen to that and get closer to that core of that spoke, um, by just leaning in. And what does it actually look like to love somebody? It doesn't mean listening with this plan to change their mind about something and get them right and clear and on the right path. And I'm going to give you the right answers. Like, that's not loving. Loving someone is just listening to them while they're crying, while they're going through something hard, while they're celebrating, and matching that moment with just a lot of presence, just holding that space, whatever that looks like. And I think that's something we have been indoctrinated often to lose. Um, like I was indoctrinated as well to defend my faith, to have all the answers. And man, the amount of grief I have looking backwards at my younger self at the missed opportunities to actually really truly connect with people, um, and hear them. We have a lifetime to make up for that. But yeah, I think that that's the thing that transforms communities from the inside out is actually learning how to love other people, which is
Agree.
just paying attention to them,
Oh,
listening to them, believing them.
I love that definition. Attention versus intention. Um, Everything that you shared to kind of was something that I came to my own when Sarah was born, and I was receiving these platitudes. Everything happens for a reason, and God doesn't give us more than we can handle, and God gives special children to special parents, and I found myself reacting internally like I wanted to punch people in the face when they said, I used to say those things to people, you know, had to come to this, I had to wrestle with that. And I look at myself and say, oh, this is maybe what I was doing with other people. I thought I had answers and I thought I had solutions. And it really wrecked me to understand that I really knew very little when it came to life, when it came to death, when it came to love and acceptance, and that I had a lot to learn. So there was this point of humility that had to happen to me through the pathway of honesty. And when you were talking just now, I was thinking about this poem that my spiritual director shared with me during this time when I was also grieving and trying to look at what does it look like to be with someone in accompaniment? What does accompaniment really mean? Just give people with their presence to just sit with me, not offer advice, not try to cut me off, not try to solve or resolve my pain, but allow me the space to just be what I was going to be in that moment and say to me, you're right. It's not fair. It is hard
Yeah.
and here for you. And these were things that I had to learn by way of experiencing it on the other side. But my spiritual director shared this poem by Rilke with me, and really technically a poem. It's in his book, Letters to a Young Poet. So he was addressed to their poet. And it's about being patient toward all involved in your life and try to love the questions themselves because the questions are so important. Is that most of the time we can't live the answers. The answers that are given to us are not sufficient and they're not something that we can hold. But if we try to learn to love the questions, which to me I interpret to mean the mystery, the unknowable, the unknown, the question, the dark, whatever, there's lots of different metaphors that people can insert there. But the mystery of life, to sit in that tension and say, I don't know. I may never know. And that's okay because there's something sacred about mystery and there's something sacred about holding that cavernous area where all kinds of things exist. Maybe nothing really is resolved, but it doesn't need to be. It just needs to be held. So that's that when you were sharing that, just that's what reminded me of that. And I think you're right. I think if most of us, no matter what our religious, spiritual beliefs and pathways are, if that's the way that we lived with that level of intention every day, I really think that we would find this collective trauma begin to heal individually
Mhm.
by one conversation, these relationships. So before I wanted to know, what did you want to add just to kind of conclude wrap up?
I think I just want to bring in because I think it's so pertinent to what you're saying right now that this movement to listen and lean in and observe and hold that space. I want to call out how much we need the feminine in this conversation. Um, I think when we look at the way that most, especially Christian faith traditions, but I think you could expand that outward, have been formed and shaped, it's around a lot of patriarchy. And I know that's a big word that's, like a catchword around and, it's fine. It should be. It's in the waters. Um, but I do see and hope that we start valuing these incredible strengths of being able to pay attention. And I don't mean the feminine qualities as though this is only for women to do. I think men need to embrace this as well. Um, but yeah, I just wanted to speak to that when you were talking because it just feels like a really important thing to bring up when we're talking about the past and the trauma and how we got here. Is that we deeply, deeply need that wisdom. To come forward. But yeah, I mean, more than anything, I just want to thank you for hosting this conversation as we wrap up because it is a big one and people have a lot of feelings about it. Thank you to everybody who showed up for this conversation to listen in. We see you and appreciate you so much. But yeah, I think more's the better to be able to start talking about this stuff. I was nervous going into this conversation, I'll admit today, because I don't often talk about the adjacent religious background that I have had, and yet it is still really important and a part of my past and my background. Um, it encourages me to embrace that more in my own writing and in my own storytelling. Um, because I mean, all we can ever do is be honest about where we've come from. Um, but it also the fact that I was nervous also speaks to what you were saying, that some of those ropes of fear and shame and insecurity are really deep cutting ones. And they are really, really hard to shed. I've been trying to do it for 20 years now. And I think by and large, I'm pretty proud of myself for where I'm at right now versus where I started. And still at 44, at this stage of my journey, I'm still like, oh, that's still there. Like the fear about talking about some of this stuff is still in there, and just recognizing and having so much kindness for yourself if this is hard to talk about. And if you're in a situation where you have family members who believe other things, or you're in a community of people where you're kind of the outlier, it takes a hell of a lot of guts and bravery to be able to sort of provide a different take on things, to complicate that narrative for people. Um, yeah, it's hard. It's hard to put that spotlight on yourself. And so I just want to acknowledge that, not only for you and I, but for anybody else who's like, I don't even know how to begin to sort of speak up about this or be a different voice. Like, you just do it clumsily and messily. Just do
I'm
it.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I was feeling nervous too. And as I was kind of processing it through my journaling this morning, I was realizing and recognizing that it has a lot to do. It's old tapes running through my head. And it is a courageous act for any individual, whatever it looks like, to start allow things to surface as they will, and to just process it privately or with a trusted friend. There's lots of ways that we can get these things out and out in the open and be honest with ourselves without compromising our safety or emotional safety. And I also was gonna just kind of wrap up with agreeing that the feminine attributes are so vital to the healing and the survival of a society. And I'm noticing that, and I agree with you, it's not a gendered issue because feminine attributes are in all of us. We all have access to them. We can all cultivate them. We can tap into them. Whether it's empathy, it's a soft start, it's active listening, it's being present without an agenda. All of these, the tenderness, having this tenderness instead of the rage and the anger, being able to sit with nuance and the tension of someone's pain. These are all feminine attributes that I agree with you are vital to changing the trajectory of where we're going. And I wanted to also mention that our identity changes over time. When you were saying a few minutes ago that it's important that you remember your roots and how that has impacted who you are as a person, that's absolutely what I think is really important part of this conversation is that we can recognize that our identity is fluid, it's not fixed. So who we once were contributes to who we are and who we are becoming, but we're not going to be the same, and that's a good thing. So I think growth, whether we're talking about in nature or we're talking about in a particular topic like religion, it doesn't matter. Growth is a stretching and it hurts. It's hard to be pruned. But when we can let ourselves lean into it, there is something really beautiful that can happen as a result. So, Kendall, I'm really grateful for your time and all of the really beautiful insights that you shared from your stories and your life experience and your conversations. It was such a gift of presence to me. I know for the people listening, it was too. So, thank you for sharing this time.
You're welcome. And me too. It's been lovely. Thank you, Jeannie.
Okay,
And
bye,
bye,
everybody.
everybody.